Hello, everybody. This is Kirk Kilgrave for the Kilgrave Corner, and my guest this time around is Rick Wood, another horror author, since that's what we do here. Horror authors talk horror. So, one of the reasons I wanted to get in touch with Rick is I've seen his books on Amazon for years now. I've always admired his book covers, and he has quite a number of series. I knew he had two before looking further in depth into Rick's bibliography. But I was like, wow, I have to really get in touch and find out what's going on with all of these. But one of the things I wanted to mention and ask him first was what, and I'll just put this to you, Rick. Thanks for coming on the show. Um, what is it about horror that really got you so sucked in that you just started to having to write it?
Wow, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because why does anyone like horror? I think, funny enough, I'm doing a PhD at the moment where I'm researching demonic horror literature, and a lot of that I've been looking at why do people like horror? And there's a horror studies person called Robin Wood who's got a theory that Freud talked about the repressed. And he believes that dreams were about what you repress. And in a society that forces monogamy and people to behave, there's got to be a lot that people repress. And that's what he believes horror movies are. I kind of go a little bit off that. I think that horror movies, for me, I mean, all art, all genres reflect society. And I think horror does that in a way that just doesn't have any containment on it, doesn't have anything that can constrain it like other genres do. And I think that horror, for me, just explores the world around you. I think you can bring most horror films or books down to the simple question of who's the real monster. And I think that's probably why horror, because it's a way to explore the world and life around me without any restraints or censorship on what you can say.
Hmm. That is fascinating. And the reason being is because, I I'm familiar with, I didn't go for a doctorate. I have a master's in library science. I'm a librarian.
Oh.
But yes, I have done, that master's thesis. And for you to write something on the demonic is just fascinating, simply because one of my questions that I wanted to throw out there is because based on a lot of the books that you have, you often write about demons. And, that was a great explanation of what you had. And going back to Freud, I would have never imagined that. So that was really insightful. But so what is it really about demons that really sets you off? It's like, I have to write about this again and again.
I find the mythology of demonology really fascinating, but not as someone who believes it, but someone who studies it. I think I lose a couple of readers every time I admit I'm an atheist and I do not believe in the paranormal or supernatural or demons. But I find them fascinating, and I find the psychology of logic behind the belief in them fascinating. And I've got a whole book, big book of demonology that goes through all demons from Zoroastrian religions, from Greek religions to Catholic and Christianity and Jewish religions. And each one has its own, in the same way that superheroes and supervillains have their mythology. Each demon has a fascinating mythology, whether it's a succubus or an incubus. And for each time I use a demon in the sensitives, in a sensitive series, I would research that demon and I would learn about the origin of that demons. And I think it's just the same reason I like superheroes as well. It's absolutely fascinating to learn how these demons came about. Because I mean, a few hundred years ago, we didn't have police, we didn't have politicians so much controlling people. So the only way the church could control society was by threatening demons if they didn't do the right thing. So there's a demon for slovenliness, a demon for being promiscuous, and it's how the church manipulated and controlled the population. And again, that's just fascinating, isn't it? How
Yes.
they created these demons for that purpose.
Purpose. Yeah. Because if you think about it, if, there is no evil, there is no religion. I mean, there's a valid point for that. Some can argue.
Well,
So,
again, another great reason I love horror is good and evil are just points of view. No one ever does really evil things without thinking, oh, I'm going to go do something evil. So I can hear my dog. She will not shut up in the background. No one will do anything believing that they're evil and doing it. I used to be a
Well,
teacher, and I used to have to deal with bullying, and very, very rarely do the bullies realize they're bullies. I mean,
huh,
and then to create something so indefinably evil in the way that religion wants to categorize things as good and evil is
yeah,
is kind of indicative of how religion views the world in a way.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, even Hitler didn't think he was a bad guy. He thought he
Oh,
was
no.
doing what was right for the world.
Yeah.
That's crazy. But
Which
so
is
you
why I
mentioned
got
the sensitives. You mentioned the sensitives. I think you're up to book 8 or 9 right now.
I finished the Sensitives with book 8.
Oh, okay.
It started with the Edward King series, which was 5 books, and then I did a spin-off of the Sensitives, which was 8 books. I just announced another spin-off series this week, which you're going to be releasing next year, called The Rogue Exorcist.
Right.
Um,
I saw that. But yeah, I was a little confused because I know the Edward King series, and then the Sensitives. It was like they were combined. So now at least I have a little bit of background as to where that was. Now, Edward King, that series, that was with the one when it starts in the beginning, he's a loser. Even his best friend thinks he's a loser. But then he has this turn of events that leads him to turn his life around, and it's because of a demon. Is that right, or am I off?
the idea is that Edward King is supposed to be hell's Messiah in the way that Jesus was heaven's Messiah.
Wow.
Edward King was conceived by hell the same way Jesus was supposedly conceived by heaven
Hmm.
and was brought earth. But he's a nice guy, and he's growing up, and he doesn't realize he has this destiny and this evil inside of him, which makes him such a fantastic exorcist because he can control all these demons. But he can control them because there's an evil inside of him, and the whole 5 series is a question of what will win, what he's been born with, or what society, what the world around him is trying to make of him, and it's a case of which one will win.
That's a pretty nice concept because we've often seen stuff like the Antichrist come in movies, whether if it's The Omen or there was a season of the American Horror Story where, like the Antichrist came in. It was a good season. But this is a little bit more where the Antichrist, well, or whatever you'd like to call it, he can actually control demons. Whereas in the other ones, I don't think that was the case. So you put your own spin on this one.
Yeah, I mean, originally the idea, I had it when I was a teenager. It was going to be a romance movie.
Huh.
I originally had an idea that someone crosses over to the other side and they see a beautiful woman, and then they come back into the real world and they keep seeing that beautiful woman and they fall in love with her. But then I thought it'd be much better if they crossed over and saw a demon and then went into
Yeah.
the real world and kept seeing the demon everywhere, and then a demon tried to hurt them. I thought that'd be much better.
Huh.
That was where the concept came from.
Yeah. So how does the spin-off for the Sensitives, where does that play in with the Edward King series, the 5 books?
So the sensitives are ultimately all people who are conceived by heaven and have an ultimate paranormal gift as a response to hell breaking a pact and conceiving Edward King.
Huh.
And so it takes place maybe 5 or 10 years after the Edward King series ends. And oh, my dog will not shut up.
Oh, don't
Um,
worry. I'm not even paying attention. All I hear is you. So,
um,
yeah.
and the sensitives then is full of people who are paranormally gifted, who are again waging a war with hell, trying to come onto Earth.
Huh.
I mean, a funny thing is, I think the Edward King series was the first series they ever published,
Hmm.
and my writing is so much better now. Yet that's the series that people still seem to enjoy the most and find to be my best series. And I read them back and I wonder why, but
Huh.
it
Isn't
seems to
that
be.
something? But yeah, I mean, I said it was the concept. It was an interesting concept. And I think from what I've just realized over the past week or two, having, been publishing for a number of years now, you can have an awesome cover, you can have a great description, you can have a great plot and all this stuff, but I think what people are looking for is a premise. There was, gosh, there was a book that I saw on Kindle, I don't know, 3 days or so ago. It was one that Amazon Publishing had put out, and I read the first 3 lines of the description, and I just went automatic buy.
Mm.
It doesn't really happen too frequently, but it's the premise. And I'm reading a book by Flint Maxwell right now called The
Mm.
Snow. and he's been really been doing knockout work on Amazon for about a year now. And not much happens in the first like 20% of the book, but he does a fantastic job of continuing to, draw your attention into the premise. It's like, this is what's going to happen, but before we get to that, this is some more backstory, and hopefully I'll have him on the show and I can ask him about that. But I think your concept is the one that's really hitting on readers. And I think eventually that's what I'm going to start doing as well, looking for more of a premise and then working, the characters in, the plot in around it. Now, you mentioned superheroes. I love superhero books or movies too. We have Guardians of the Galaxy behind me. But is that something that you patterned your series around, like a big, I don't know, sort of like the Thor series? There's three of them now, coming up four, or is it more? I mean, I'm doing like a Marvel MCU type horror thing, supernatural thriller thing. Is that any part of what you're looking to do, or
I
no?
guess only in the way that in comics they always create a world. Like DC has its world where everyone exists together, and they all have their own series. I guess in a way, the Edward King series, the Sensitives, and the Rogue Exorcist are all just part of the same world in that way. And Edward King has his own mythology behind where he came from and what the devil's trying to do. The Sensitives have their own mythology, and as the series progresses, I explore that more and more. So I guess the mythology aspect of it is, but I've always been a big fan of comic books, so I guess they got to influence me some way.
Yeah. All right. Now, I mentioned you have a number of series, and you
Yeah,
also just mentioned, gosh, what was the one that you just mentioned that's coming out next year? One of my questions was, this one's coming out in July 15th, almost an entire year from now.
it'll be sooner.
Um,
I,
it's
I
coming out
always
sooner?
I always put a pre-order up in about a year. Then once the book's nearly ready, I'll then move it forward. So it'll probably be more like January.
Oh, okay, cool. Do you have, I mean, so that's only 6 months from now. So I'm guessing you probably have an idea what the book is going to be, or have you already started it?
I have a rough idea. It's going to be the Rogue Exorcist is going to be a guy who's kind of detached from the sensitives because he doesn't like how the church covers things up and doesn't like how they do things. It's pretty much as far as I got at the moment. I mean,
Huh, okay,
I release about a book every 1 or 2 months.
right.
Probably takes about 3 months in total to write one. So in about 3 months, I'll then, when it comes time to write it, I'll probably start writing down what the ideas are.
Hmm.
But it's going to take a few months of me going on dog walks and coming up with it. And then I've got a book out this month and one out next month and one in September. They're all my focus at the moment. As you've said, I've got a lot of series on the go, so there's always a lot of stuff
Right.
um,
So you
going
must
on.
have a lot of ideas constantly just like popping up in your imagination that do you have to write these down so you don't lose them and then maybe come back to them later?
Um, Not really, but I mean, normally I'll come up with an idea and then I'll create the cover. That's
Hmm.
normally the first thing I do, and I absolutely love making book covers. I've made all of my book covers. I've made lots of different versions throughout the years, and so I normally, if I come up with an idea, I'll sit down, I'll come up with a few book covers. From the book cover, then from the images I find, I then get more ideas. But I mean, the ones I've been concentrating on recently are Blood Splatter books, which are all
Hmm.
standalone books, and each one I just wanted to cover a different subgenre of horror. So it's not that hard once you select a subgenre of horror to then come up with it. Like the one I'm writing the first draft at the moment is a rape and revenge.
Hmm.
I mean, that story is pretty much straightforward.
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
kind of things that happen to it, and that's what happens. The story's already there, and I spit in your grave, Deliverance, The Last House on the Left. The story's
Yeah.
already written. I just got to create my own characters and I can apply to it.
Well, that's awesome that you're actually creating your own covers because when I bought the Sensitives, it was with the little blonde girl with I think the pigtails that she had.
That
And that was like a
was a
creepy thing
long
that
time
said,
ago.
what was that?
That was a long time ago. That cover. I was at least 2 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm always picking up books, I have like 2,000 on my Kindle. I'm never going to read them all, but I just, sometimes I just buy them because I like the covers. And you redid it recently, and I was like, oh, I like that cover even more. So I'm waiting to go back onto my digital management for my Kindle so I can update it to get the new cover that you just put on there for that book because it looks awesome.
There's
But
real kind of art to the book cover, the new Sensitives book cover.
mhm.
So I mean, it's not the favorite book cover I've come up with, but a book cover isn't a stunning piece of art. It's what sells the book, and it needs to be subliminally recognized by the customer that they know exactly what kind of books it's going to be. And so with the font at top where it says book one in the Sensitives, that is the font that they use on the cover of The Exorcist.
Oh,
The font
cool.
for my name, Rick Wood, is the font that Stephen King uses for his name. The Sensitives font is one that I found other indie horror authors, and I put the titles of their book covers into a font recognizer to find out what font they're using, and that's that one. And then I've looked at all the paranormal horror books, and they all tend to have like when it's a demonic woman, have like that woman picture on it. So I've put that on. So the idea behind that is that you look at that and you know what book it's going to be without having to read anything or more about it. You will know it's paranormal horror.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Now you mentioned the Blood Splatter books. I was going to mention that. I think you're up to 6 now, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I was going to ask you about, what this one is. So I'm glad you mentioned already that it's different subgenres. That is something that is fantastic because there are so many in the horror genre. You can bust out, like you said, the final girl. You can do, I mean, slashers or whatever you want to say about it, paranormal, demonic possession. There's so much you can do. I'm wondering, do you have an idea how many you might write up to? Like 15, 20? Any
Um,
idea?
a lot, a lot. I mean, the idea kind of came from. Do you have the Goosebumps series in the US? Goosebumps.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what's his name?
R.L. Stein.
Stein. Yeah.
But they're American made, aren't they? What am I on about? Of course they are. And when I was a kid, they used to be 3 for 2 in W.H. Smith's, and it was the only way my mum could get me to read. So every
Huh.
time I went into town, she'd get me 3 Goosebumps books, and I go and read them. Then I got older, and it was point horror, and I liked how it was the same series, but they all covered different kind of subgenres. And my idea was, as an adult, I want one of those, and so a few years ago started coming up. Originally, they were going to be called Beneath the Bed Horror, but then I
Huh.
came up with Blood Splatter books, um,
Huh.
and then yeah, I think there's as long as I can come up with ideas for more subgenres, then I'll keep going until they're all done. Um, yeah, why not? Whatever subgenre I haven't covered, I'll hopefully cover at some point.
Yeah, that's awesome. I recently had Jeff Strand on the show, and he was
Yeah,
talking about when he works and how he comes up with plots and so forth. It's a little bit similar to what you were
he's a
mentioning, just picking a
cyberpunk author, isn't he, Jeff Strand?
he's awesome. Yeah. And his wife creates his book covers, some of which are really great. But yeah, that guy's written about 50 books right now. And just
Target him with a lot of my advertising. I know a lot about his books.
yeah, and
That's how I heard about you, to be honest, Kirk. I'm targeting you with my Amazon advertising.
yeah, that's kind of how we do it, What with the people who are out there who are doing well at the time, just hit in with them and hopefully get some more some people to get their eyeballs on it and so forth. There was one book of yours that I was really interested in, The Death Club, Will Cody. That you only have one out so far, and you wrote that with a co-author. Tell me a little bit about that
It's
one.
actually written by myself under a different name originally. Um,
Okay.
so I also write action thrillers under a pseudonym of Ed Grace,
Okay.
kind of their Lee Child-esque ones. And originally, The Death Club was going to be written by Ed Grace. And then I changed my mind and said, no, I want to write it as Rick Wood. And Amazon just haven't taken Ed Grace off, so it looks like I've written it with myself.
It's interesting because I saw the other picture and I was like, that looks like Rick, but I can't be certain, so I'll have to ask him about it.
No, fact is, because I make my living off being a writer.
Mhm.
I'll be completely honest with you. Horror is a really difficult genre to make a living on and sustain a living. And I just got to the point where it was getting too difficult to do, and I was going to need to do a more popular genre. So, under a pseudonym of Ed Grace, I started writing kind of Lee Child-esque action thrillers about an ex-assassin called Jay Sullivan. And the crazy thing is, I've written 3 of them, and I've written maybe 30, 40 horror books. Those 3 action thriller books sell probably more than all the horror books combined, which is
Wow.
really frustrating when I want to be a horror author.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
but yeah,
Why do you think that is? You mentioned that horror is such a difficult genre to tackle, to get an
I could
audience.
tell you exactly why it is. Is because if you look at the data as to who reads, it is overwhelmingly something like at least 80% women,
Hmm.
and primarily women between the ages of 35 and 55. They're the majority of people who read books. And most people in that category, I'm making a very broad assumption because I know it doesn't apply to everyone. I know there are women who read horror in that category, but most people in that category will not read that, which is why romance covers more than 60% of books that are sold,
Right.
um, because that's the demographic. Very few men actually read, very few young people read. Those that do will read my books, and most of my readers, I'm aware, are women between 35 and 55, but that's because they're statistically more likely to be a person who would read a book,
Hmm.
if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's just not the target audience to make it big with horror,
Hmm.
if you see what I mean. We want young people in their late teens and 20s to be reading, then we're making an absolute killing. But I mean, those people in that category do read horror. Some of them do. Otherwise, we won't sell any books at all.
Hmm.
But it's just the fact of who reads.
Hmm.
Um, Horror as a genre, though, seems to have it had a real boom in the 70s and 80s, and then it's gone straight down. In the 90s, we had Scream, which was taking the piss out of horror, wasn't it? To be honest. And then it's not been that popular genre since then as well. So I'd say the lack of major popularity in the genre since the 80s, and the people who read books, it just doesn't make for um,
Yeah.
great potential to be a horror author.
So, I know exactly what you're talking about with women being the primary readership, of the genders. I've done some research on that as an author would. And being a librarian, I get more like journals and stuff like that too about who reads, what they read, why they read, and so forth. And you're right. I mean, most of my readership, most of the people who read my books are women. Those are the people who join my newsletter, who go on to Facebook and like my stuff or whatever. And yeah, usually like yesterday, I was at work and there was a woman who was looking for like 6 books. Most of them were romance, and her husband wanted a book on a cop from Chicago who got involved with the mob. He wasn't reading fiction. And most of the guys who do read fiction are reading thrillers or action books, that mysteries, that sort of thing.
Not
But
like Donnie
I,
Brasco is what he was asking for.
no, I
No?
don't think so. I think Donnie
Well,
Brasco
sorry to
was in
interrupt
the
you.
East Coast. But what I think happened, like you said, horror was big in the 70s and 80s, and Scream came out in the 90s and made fun of the genre. And then scary movies, the scary movie, the 4 or 5 or how many ever they've done, did the same thing. But I do think horror has had a comeback, especially with movies over the past 10 years. I think it's primarily done to the low budget that you can put in a movie with just anybody seemingly, as
Well, do you
long
know
as
what
you get.
the
I'm
most
sorry.
profitable movie ever made was? Do you know what it is?
Let me wait, don't tell me the Paranormal Activity.
Exactly, yeah. It
Yeah.
didn't make the most money, but because it
No,
cost something like
50K.
15,000, yeah, to
Or
make,
maybe it was 15,000. I knew it was with a five in there. And yeah, 15 or 50,000, and it ended up making over $100,000. Before that, the other most profitable movie ever made was Blair Witch Hunt or Blair Witch Trial, whatever that one was.
project.
Project, thank you. So yeah, and again, I think that had a budget of like $5,000. So yeah, it's fascinating the people who like horror seemingly like watching the movies
Mm.
because it's an hour and a half, it's 2 hours, they can get their fear and then they're done. But for books, it's a little bit different. And that's one thing I'm a little uncertain about. Do you have an idea why people might be
There's
more willing to do movies than books?
because the kind of people who read are the kind of people who go to horror movies aren't necessarily the kind of people who read. And also there's a huge difference between, and you're probably going to hate me for when I say this, someone who reads Stephen King and thinks that horror, and someone who really reads horror.
No, no,
You know,
doesn't bother me.
I really, really don't get Stephen King. I really don't get it. I just find his books so boring. Some of his earlier ones were right, but they bore the hell out of me. Nothing happens. I like The Shining and Carrie. Apart from that, I mean, Lizzie's story, 100 pages, I gave up.
Yeah.
And people think Stephen King is horror, but he's not extreme enough to be horror. He's not real horror. I mean, that's what Splatterpunk was. It was reaction to the mainstream nature of Stephen King in the 80s. That Splatterpunk then came out saying, no, that's not horror. We'll show you horror. And I think that people's gateway to horror is Stephen King. And then they read real horror after Stephen King. And I mean, I've had customer reviews that say, I like Stephen King, but I didn't like this.
Yeah. Stephen King, he was horror back in the 70s and 80s, and he really hasn't done much in the genre since then. He had The Institute, which came out a couple of years ago, that was more paranormal based. But you're right, he's been focusing more on mysteries. He did a historical novel, like time travel thing. The guy, I have to give him a lot of credit because he is a fantastic writer when it comes to character development. If you're willing to wait, like you said.
I'm not willing to wait. If
Hmm.
something doesn't grip me straight away, it doesn't deserve my attention. I mean,
Yeah.
you can make brilliant characters and spend time developing them and also make it interesting. I mean, in Harry Potter, not horror, I know, Harry Potter, nothing happens till at least halfway through. In Girl on the Train, nothing happens till halfway through. But I love hanging out with the character in Girl on the Train.
Hmm.
I think
See, Harry Potter, a girl I was seeing way back when told me, you gotta read it, you gotta read it. And since I worked in a library, I was like, come on, everybody likes this book. It's probably crap. So I started reading within the first 7 or 8 pages. I realized that it deserved every bit of accolades for it. I thought it was just fantastic. The world building was just amazing, and I was just hooked from there. So maybe nothing did happen. I haven't read it since when it first came out, but I fucking loved it. I thought it was fantastic.
it's an obsession.
So,
I've got 6 Harry Potter tattoos.
oh, do you? So you do like them then?
Yeah, big fan. I've
All
got
right.
a Harry Potter wand behind me as well. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
awesome. Cool. All right. So we talked a little bit, and I'm so glad I have you on the show because, especially, since you're doing this thesis that you're doing, we can really delve into some horror stuff here. Like I said, I think horror has been coming back over the last 3 or 4 years. Some of the big, hitters in our genre outside of the big published ones like Paul Tremblay and
Paul Tremblay, he liked my tweet the other day, and I was
oh
so
yeah,
excited.
awesome.
It's
What
funny
was the
because
tweet?
I've been studying his book in a Head Full of Ghosts. I've been writing a chapter of my PhD on that book, and
Cool.
so I've been doing a lot of studying of it and a lot of picking it apart.
All
And
right.
I tweeted about me doing it, and I tagged him in it. Yeah, and he liked it. And
Awesome.
people always like it when I reply to their Facebook messages, and I sometimes get a response saying, "Oh my God, I'm starstruck now." Now, please, I'm an ex-drama teacher from England. It's not. Um, but I understand after Paul Tremblay liking my tweet just how exciting it is.
It is exciting. And, I actually just finished reading that book about a month ago. There was there were, I think, two like really terrifying moments for me in that book. And it's difficult to scare me. I've told Lee Mountford about one of his books that just scared the hell out of me. And it's difficult in the horror field to scare people because they're waiting. That's what they're waiting for. The whole book, they're waiting for it. What do
I
you
think
think about that aspect? Are there certain parts when you're writing, do
I,
you just
I
think, oh, have to have a horror part, a scary part right here?
think people need to get over the idea that horror needs to be scary because it's not. There's many great horror movies and great horror books that aren't necessarily scary. That's not the defining feature of the genre. But if you ask me what the defining feature of the genre is, it'd be very hard to define. It's something that encompasses the darker side of life, something that doesn't censor what it shows to you. And it's don't get me wrong, a lot of horror is scary, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, the cabin at the end of, oh, not cabin, sorry, that's a different book. Head Full of Ghosts. For me, what I'm basing my chapter on is that whole book is about perception and what is truth. How do we get truth? How is our perception influenced? So the whole way through it, we're questioning, is this girl ill, possessed, or vindictive? What is she? And we, all the time, the narrator, Mary, she keeps on inserting, she keeps on giving us a childish perspective in the narration. Then suddenly her adult version will then say, oh, this isn't a very reliable memory. So if it's not reliable, how do we know? And then we keep getting new information that changes it, and reality TV comes in, and we see how they set everything up to skew the perception of who watches a television program. And ultimately, if you believe she's possessed or if you believe she's ill, it's probably going to be because of your own bias. Because I'm an atheist, I leave it thinking, well, she's ill. If you absolutely believe in demons, you'll leave it thinking she's possessed. And that's what the brilliant thing about that book is. It asks, what is real, what is truth, and how do you define truth? And I've read quite a few confusing essays to write this stats on my PhD about philosophers arguing what is truth. That's ultimately what that book is about. And that is a question it asks in a way another genre couldn't, because there's too many restrictions with other genres. And that's what makes it horror. That's not necessarily scary, but it's hard to define. That is what makes it horror. It's questioning who's the real monster. And ultimately in it, I think the real monster is the girl's parents.
Yeah.
Is the dad.
Yeah. Now you touched on something about, what is truth. There's different possibilities in his novel as to what, is the monster, if you want to put it that way. But, a lot of times I hear horror writers who always seem to be a lot more, have a ton more background on the history of the genre and, what other authors have done and so forth. You're looking at more of an academic aspect for your research. What do you think about the need to create horror that says something about our society at any given time?
I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I
Hmm.
think it's impossible to create a bit of art without being influenced by your environment. I think some writers set out to say, and I'm going to make a statement about this,
Mhm.
but I don't know, rarely do they probably set out with the intention, but ultimately it will still reflect the society in which it's written. For example, American horror in the 1950s was all about an outside threat. It was always aliens or people
Right.
coming from outside. Whereas in the 80s, it was all about suburban life and it was about horror from within. And I don't think anyone did that intentionally, but that shows how after the war ended and just before Vietnam, there was a fear of alien threat of people coming and attacking the country. Whereas in the 80s, it was more, I can't remember what the name of the president was in the 80s, but he was more someone
Reagan.
that's it. It was more scared of what was going on inside the White House, inside it. And it was, so if you watch, I can't remember what film it is. There's a film that just shows David Cronenberg, maybe? I can't remember. Blue Velvet? No. Where it shows a suburban neighborhood at the beginning and people acting really nicely. And there's that image, and then there's a question of what's behind it. And that was 1980s American horror.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
Blue Velvet. I know that one started with the neighborhood, and then there was like a finger in the grass. I wasn't sure if that's what you were thinking, because that was
possibly,
it
possibly.
was kind of a slow
It's been a
movie,
while
but
since
I
I've
thought it
seen it.
was pretty good. I mean, Dennis Hopper was nuts in that movie, and I just very scary, just because.
I studied it in my undergraduate, but I can't remember anything about it.
Yeah, yeah, it's been a long time for me too, probably 20 years, but I just remember that dude acting like a nut job, and oh, you'd have to like people who are watching this, go to YouTube, type in Dennis Hopper, Blue Velvet. I don't know, even the car scene. And that's what I remember. It was just nuts, just crazy. And it's just one of the reasons it is because the rest of the movie, but leading up to that, is kind of slow. Not a ton is happening, and all of a sudden dude just breaks out the crazy. But
Let's look at the horror that we have now, and it tells us about a lot about society. So we have the last days of Jack Sparks. We have A Head Full of Ghosts. Last days about of Jack Sparks is all about a guy obsessed with social media and about the image he's creating on the internet. Head Full of Ghosts is about reality television. This is telling us that we're scared about what these things are doing to us and the influence that happens, seeing as that's something that's always seen as a negative in horror movies, which is what is possibly being suggested with the kind of literature and films we're getting at the moment.
Huh, interesting. So I've been told that that my podcasts are too long. We're running up around like 40 minutes or so.
Wow,
So I think
already?
we're gonna, what was that?
So already?
Yeah, it seems like it's shot by, right? But I don't want to bore our viewers, which leaves me to a possibility of bringing you back in the future. So I'm
Cool.
hoping that'd be awesome. I'm hoping we could do that in the future. Mostly what I try to do is bring people out whenever they're promoting a new book, a new series, something like that. And it was a hell of a fun time talking horror with you. Great. I think people are going to really like this episode because you really got into some more heavy themes and stuff like that about why we like horror, about what's difficult for writers and readers and so forth. So, Rick, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I enjoyed it.
All right, and I'm hoping I'll see you next time. For everybody else, I will see you guys next time as well. Take care, everybody. Be safe.